Our fall series we're calling Church Building in honor of the Apostle Paul, whose ministry was spreading the gospel to different places and to build churches around the ancient world. And we're subtitling it Lessons from Letters because everything he wrote in these letters to these churches he was building, well, much of it at least, still has lessons for us. And today's comes from what we call Philippians, which is his letter to the church at Philippi. There are some different kinds of letters, so some are more like treatises, essays on something, and some are just letters. Straight up letters, letters of affection, friendship letters, and this seems to be one of those. He says, I love you, thank you, this is how I'm doing, this is what I want for you, I hope you're doing this as well, and I hope to see you soon. Which is all the more remarkable considering the conditions in which this letter was written. More on that later. This translation is from what is known as the First Nations version. It is an indigenous translation of the New Testament from which we draw occasionally here. They have a wonderful way of rendering some of these familiar passages. There are some great phrases in here only in this translation, which is why we have it here this morning. And from that version, Philippians 1:20 through 30 reads this way. From deep in my spirit comes the hope that I will never face the shame of defeat, but that I will have the courage now and always to bring honor to the chosen one by the way I live or by the way I die. How can I lose? The chosen one is my life, and death only brings me something better. Even if death would be a better choice, living in this world means my work will bear good fruit. So I do not know which way to go. I am being pulled from both directions. On the one hand, I desire to go and be with the chosen one, which would be far better than staying here in this world. But on the other hand, staying here to help you is needed even more. Since I am needed here, I am sure that I will stay so I can continue to walk you down a road of joy and strengthen your faith. Then when I come face to face with you once again, you can be full of joy and stand tall in what the chosen one Creator sets free has done through me. Whatever happens, you should walk in a manner that brings honor to the good story about the chosen one. In this way, whether or not I come to see you, I will hear that you are standing firm in one spirit, having one purpose, and struggling together to hold true to the good story in which we have put our trust. Show courage in the face of those who oppose you. This will be a sign to them that they are coming to a bad end, but for you it will be a sign that Creator is setting you free. For you have been given the honor not only to trust in the chosen one, but also to suffer for him. For you are now struggling in the same spiritual battle you saw me fight in the past, one I am still fighting. May God add understanding to the hearing of these words. Will you pray with me, please? Holy and gracious God, be within us and among us as we turn our hearts and our minds to you. Amen. Let's start this week with a reintroduction of Paul, or maybe a reappreciation of Paul. My guess is that most of us know that name. Some of us know a lot of what he wrote very well, maybe even more than we think we do. We know him as St. Paul or the Apostle Paul. It's a lofty figure. He's a legend of our faith. Or maybe we actually don't know that much about him at all. We know the name and little else, which would be understandable. So maybe this is a time, as I said, for a reintroduction and a reappreciation of Paul. I did that this week, and I know it was helpful for me. The first thing I think to say is that there is no overstating Paul's influence on who we are. He did more than anyone next to Jesus to form what we today call Christianity. He wrote most of what we call the New Testament. And again, next to Jesus, he is by far the most important figure in Christian history. In fact, you can make a real case that what we call Christianity today is actually formed more by Paul's writings than by Jesus' teachings. That is another sermon and would likely get me fired. But we know more about Paul than anyone else, actually. He is the most self-revealing, autobiographical, of any figure in the New Testament. We know more about where he went, what he did, what he was thinking the entire time than anybody else. And I think in part because he is so prominent, such a larger-than-life figure, but also in a strange way so familiar, he becomes, I think, at times kind of easy to take for granted. It's become pretty easy and pretty popular at times to Monday morning quarterback Paul, which I've probably been guilty of more than once. Nitpicking his theology, rolling our eyes at his sometimes exorbitant sense of himself, analyzing how his ancient worldview doesn't always age well, asking these letters to be something they were never intended to be, and then being disappointed when they come up short, studying his life as an abstract academic curiosity, using his words out of context to say something he never would have said. Christians do all of these things and more to Paul, often forgetting that there was a real person behind all of this, a real person doing his best, and a real person whose devotion few, if any, could match. And from what we know, he went through some real suffering in service of his work. And quickly, he gives this summary of his own. This is from his second letter to the Corinthians. He says this about what he's been through. He says, often near death, 5 times I have received from the Jewish authorities 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. For a night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from bandits, danger from my own people, danger from the Gentiles. Danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, in toil and in hardship through many a sleepless night, hungry and thirsty, often without food, cold and naked. And besides other things, I am under daily pressure because of my anxiety for all the churches. Which one of us would sign up for that life? As I said, I don't know that there is anyone who can touch his devotion, his single-minded, almost obsessive, all-consuming call to share the gospel and build faithful churches. No one else seemed to speak in such radical, almost mystical, complete transformation language about being fully overtaken by the love of God, and in fact inhabited by Christ. He said, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives within me. And I have this sense that if you asked Paul whether it was all worth it, the labor, suffering, risk, pain, danger, all of this in service of the spread of the gospel, if you asked him whether or not that was all worth it, I have this sense that he wouldn't even really understand the question. He said, what else is there? I can picture him asking, and what else could I do? I say all this about Paul in part to reground us in as close to his reality as we can get. These things he's writing to us about across 2,000 years, the things he's preaching about, they weren't just ideas he was thinking about. This was how he really struggled to live real life. This was how he was putting his faith to work in what were often horrible circumstances. So when Paul gets a little challenging sometimes, a little uncompromising sometimes, or a lot of other things, it's good to remember that he wasn't asking his congregations, he wasn't asking us to do anything that he wasn't willing to do or hadn't already done. But also, and in a more immediate way, I share this because, and this matters because Paul was writing this letter from prison. It's one of many times he was imprisoned and facing execution. Even though we don't know exactly when and how it happened, eventually he was executed. One of those times was the last time. And we have to believe that while he was writing this, there was a part of him wondering if this would be it. You can hear him working it out. working through it, knowing death was a real possibility. He says, even if death would be a better choice, living in this world means my work will bear good fruit, so I don't know which way to go. I am being pulled from both directions. How natural is that? How many of us have heard someone said or said ourselves some version of, it's not that I'm afraid of death exactly, it's just that I love living, and there's more I need to do. I'm not ready to be done yet. This is where Paul seems to be, trying to face faithfully life and death. Or maybe it would be better to say life and life, because that seems to be how he thinks of it. It's not really death as much as it is living with God. His choice is living here or living there. Either way, he is living. It's a great line from this translation where he says, how can I lose? It's not life and death. It's life here or life there, and it is all held by God. Paul has an extraordinary faith that whatever happens, it is all held by God, and that nothing can shake that. One of the most beautiful things ever written, let alone that he wrote, comes from his letter to the Romans. And he says, for I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation can separate us from the love of God. And here he is in prison, facing his own death, believing that God holds this moment too. Just earlier in this letter, he actually goes on to say how grateful he is that because he's imprisoned, the gospel is being preached to the imperial guard, his guards, whom he otherwise would not have been able to reach. And he rejoices in that, which is very Paul. And it's not that he's meant to be there exactly, or that he wouldn't rather be somewhere else. It's not that God caused him to be there even. It is more about his remarkable ability to put his faith to work wherever he was. This radical sense that Paul had, that there is no place he could be that God wouldn't be able to use him there. And I believe him, or at least I believe him that he believes that, and I want someday to believe like that. He fully trusted that God was with him. God was everywhere and could use anything. And so his suffering wasn't useless. When things were going great, great. But even more so when things were awful. And as we heard earlier, there was a lot of awful. But he could still find this pathway from suffering to hope. He says elsewhere, one more Paul quote for the day. He says, we also boast in our sufferings because suffering produces endurance. And endurance produces character. And character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us. I can hear him reciting this to himself as he trudged down another strange road, or he shivered out in the open through another night. Suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. Character produces hope. Hope does not disappoint us. I wonder how long this was Paul's mantra, so to speak. How often he had to tell himself this before he ever had a chance to tell someone else. He knew that. He learned that because he lived it. Paul's faith and Paul's calling to that ministry, it did not keep him from difficult things. In fact, it brought him to difficult, dangerous, uncomfortable, painful places. And it would be that same way to anyone who tried to follow. He tells that church here, for you have been given the honor not only to trust in the chosen one, but also to suffer for him or with him. For you are now struggling in the same spiritual battle you saw me fight in the past, one I am still fighting. If you are faithful, he says, you will be engaged and fully alive and put to work doing difficult things. And it will be a struggle. Not only with this path of discipleship not keep you from struggling, it will bring you to it. It will make you face it. And in fact, the struggle will actually be a sign that you are engaged and fully alive and working hard on difficult things. But again, he says, you're not alone, and I'm not asking you to do anything I'm not doing too. Our lesson from this letter is to keep that same faith modeled by Paul here. The faith that he would ask of any people that would call themselves a church. Not just even when we're suffering or when we're struggling, but especially when we're suffering or we're struggling. Keep that same faith that you are held by God. And I don't mean everything happens for a reason. I don't mean God is doing this to test you or any of the other things that we say to one another as a way of saying, maybe this is actually a good thing if you think about it better. No. Some things are just awful. And God doesn't cause them. And they're not meant to be, whatever that means. But whatever happens, it does not separate us from God. And when God is there, there is love and there is hope. Not to make everything okay right away, not to go back to how it was before, but to heal and work and grow and co-create something new. Whatever happens, God is with us. Whatever happens, the answer is to face it in faith. It's a hard lesson, but I think Paul would say it was a necessary one, and it is one that he learned over and over again. It's a lesson he really lived. Our faith is not here to keep us happy and comfortable, to keep us from pain, or to keep us safe even. Our faith is here to sustain and guide us and keep us alive through challenging, unpredictable, often painful, real life. Paul had an untouchable faith. It's a wonderful noise, especially because it's not mine. Paul had an untouchable faith. And the faith didn't keep him from suffering, but it did help him make meaning out of that suffering. His faith didn't keep him from being imprisoned. It allowed him to find possibilities for ministry even in prison. Paul's faith didn't keep him from dying. His faith and ours means we can face whatever happens with courage and trust, giving ourselves to the love that holds it all. Thanks be to God. Amen.